Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me. We talk about faith and politics and all kinds of topics that really matter in our culture. So if you're tired of all the screamers out there taking all the oxygen out of the room and you want to join us in taking some of that space back, you'll love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and I am really grateful to have this forum to talk to some cool people and talk about hard topics, but do it in a cool way where people come together and agree to disagree sometimes, and sometimes we get into scraps, but we're trying to do it in a different way, in goodwill and in good faith. Please remember to subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have and you're digging what we do, please tell a friend, give us a good rating and leave a review. Easiest way to find us is our main site, which is www.politicsandreligion.us. Or feel free to connect with me on all the social media apps at Corey S. Nathan. That's at Corey, S as in Sam, Nathan, at Corey S. Nathan. We'd love to connect and hear what you think of what we're doing here at Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, with, like I said, some of the coolest people in the country, like Lanae Erickson. Lanae Erickson is Senior Vice President for Social Policy and Politics at Third Way, where she tackles hot-button issues like immigration, abortion, religious liberty, education, and guns. Previously, Lanae served as a member of President Obama's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. She was also legislative counsel at Alliance for Justice, and before that at the Legal Rights Center and the Center for Victims of Torture. Lanae's commentary has been featured in the Washington Post, the New York Times, USA Today, Politico, and PBS NewsHour, among other outlets. And she's also appeared on NPR, Fox News, C-SPAN's Washington Journal, CNN, Bloomberg Television, and is a regular contributor to one of our favorite podcasts, Politicology, with all our pals over there. And if you didn't think Lanae was busy enough, she is also the principal second violinist in DC's Capital City Symphony. So, all right. So first, tell me about that. How do you fit that being, major league violinist into everything else you're doing?
It is actually kind of my reprieve time, because I find that especially when you're privileged enough to do a job that you really love and you care about and work on things that you're thinking about all day long and have a passion for, sometimes it's hard to turn your brain off. And so I find that when I am, watching Netflix or just hanging out, I'm also still thinking about work. But when I am sight reading Schubert, I can't be thinking about work.
Right.
It really takes up all my brain space. So then after a 3-hour orchestra rehearsal on a Thursday night, I feel more rested than if I had just, sat on the couch and watched The Crown. So yeah, it's actually been a fantastic outlet for me and an opportunity to meet people that aren't always doing exactly what I'm doing, which is often the people that you surround yourself with in DC.
It almost sounds like your time with music, whether it's with the orchestra, or I imagine you would do some practice on your own, is a similar space as a lot of folks have discovered meditation, for example.
Yes. Yeah. I'm also a big yoga meditation person, but the impact on my brain is very similar. I think it's like just having your brain fully taken up by something that's not your day to day really helps when you have to get back into the day to day to feel like you can keep going.
I discovered meditation last year after 3 people who I love and love me, that I trust, independently all said, like, they were just kind of prompting me, dude, have you checked out meditation? And I don't know, at first I thought my squirrel brain wouldn't allow for it,
Yeah.
But having started just with literally 3-minute guided meditations, it is the biggest game changer of certainly the last year, but arguably over the last decade or more. Just like my mental equilibrium, homeostasis, that's the right word. My mental homeostasis is different, and had the effect that I was diagnosed with bipolar about 15 years ago. And I tried various pharmaceutical regimens that I only experienced the unwanted side effects, and none of what they were describing would happen. But doing meditation, I looked back at my notes from back then, from 15 or so years ago, and that's what meditation did. Like my brain chemistry, I think, is changing, like quite literally. So
yeah, and I think it's people often feel like they have to be like really good at it, and be able to sit for an hour and not have a thought cross their brain. But one of my colleagues, Luke Watson, who does a lot of the professional development and leadership development at Third Way, where I work, is very focused on just making sure you can do what you can do, and then not feeling like a failure if some thought comes into your mind. Just like watch it pass, and then try not to hold on to it. Just try to like let it flow through you, and then get back to it. And that's really helped me to not feel like I'm failing at meditation, because I'm a very type A person who wants to be good at things.
Yeah.
It's hard if you feel like you're supposed to be perfect at it to get any better.
That was a big that was part of what opened the gates for me, is learning a couple of the guided meditations I do. They call it noting. So noting my thoughts, and almost like it was an epiphany of sorts, because I realized, oh, that thought isn't me. It doesn't capture me or hold me. It's a separate thing, and I can gently let it pass and focus back on my breathing. So that was a big one. Now, how does being a musician shape or influence your work in politics, or do you specifically keep those two disciplines completely separate?
I think that they certainly influence each other in my level of creativity. I think one of the things that we really focus on at Third Way, and have done really well over the 2 decades that the organization has been around almost, is trying to kind of take risks and be creative. And there are so many myriad problems in our current political system, in our country, and the same solutions or approaches that we've been using for the past however many decades haven't fixed them. So we need to try some other stuff. So I think the improvisational quality and creative quality of playing music definitely helps me to be a little bit more improvisational in my work, and say, okay, well, that didn't really work out. Let's go try this other thing. Or what if we thought about it a completely different way? And then it also just it really helps me learn how to work as a team without always having to speak everything. One of my favorite things to do is play chamber music, and you have to breathe together, and you're not going to say, okay, we're going to start now. You don't even start by saying 1, 2, 3, 4, start. You just breathe. And I think that that kind of teamwork quality and integrating with other people and how they're working is also a big component of my work.
Wow. So do you stay chamber music, classical? You mentioned Schubert. Do you ever branch out and play in other genres, jazz or fiddle or what have you? Or
Yeah, usually I do it now for the instrument petting zoo that we have. We have a family concert where everybody can bring kids and they can play with our instruments. And kids always think that fiddle is much cooler than violin. So I play a little fiddle music for them then. I had done jazz in the past, but haven't for a while. I'm, aforementioned type A person. I gravitate more to the kind of those standard, classical pieces, the Schuberts, the Mozarts, the Beethovens. And I love the like really, really big, loud symphonies, because it's just kind of all encompassing.
Yeah. One of my favorite characters in TV over the last 15, 20 years is from the show Treme. It was an HBO show that it takes place after the flood in New Orleans. And this one character is a classically trained violinist who first hooks up with some street musicians in New Orleans, and then slowly but surely uses violin in any number of different outlets, whether it's Prez Hall type stuff or the more classical settings. Really fascinating character, and her evolution was one of my favorites. So I'm thinking of little Lanae. So little Lanae started playing violin in first grade. But something else I read about when you were a kid is that in the 5th grade, you know what I'm going to say, right? You voted for Ross Perot in your class's mock election. That captured my attention, because it's pretty young to be thinking independently in that way. So I was curious how you were arriving at, was your family the type that sat around the dinner table and had these conversations about politics, or how did you arrive at such an independent conclusion like that?
Yeah, certainly not. I grew up in rural northern Minnesota, and both of my parents have, non-political jobs, don't really want to, they vote, and they're fantastic citizens, and they're very engaged in their community and in their church, but they are not, people who like to talk about politics. That's for sure. So, in fact, I don't think that they even, as they would take me to go when they were voting, they wouldn't even tell me who they were voting for.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's a very Minnesotan, this is my private decision kind of a thing, but I went to Catholic school, and I was in kind of a fairly conservative, rural community. And so I certainly had some of those, viewpoints and values that were instilled in me very early about hard work and about taking responsibility for your own actions. And I could also see that there were a lot of things that were kind of messed up in the world that maybe wasn't just about, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. So I think I liked the idea of kind of mixing the values that drive both the left and the right of politics, the good parts of the values. There are certainly bad parts too, and kind of bringing that together in a way that was less inside the box. And whether Ross Perot was really that person or not, I was like 10, so I don't know. But the idea that I don't have to choose between a lesser of two evils, I can kind of make up my own path, was very appealing to me.
Right, right. Now, I've heard you describe your family as very politically mixed family.
Yeah.
But you didn't talk about politics. How did you know that?
Yeah, I mean, well, I know it now because what I do necessitates talking about politics like all the time, or at least encourages it. So there is no way I can go to a Erickson family reunion and not get asked about, every manner of thing about what's happening in DC at this point. So whether or not that's what I really want to be talking about.
Yeah.
But, I describe my mom politically as a person who is very independent, union member, but Catholic, and has a lot of her own ideas, and just didn't want to be kind of put in a box. And so she's kind of your classic swing voter in the Midwest. And so she's always my touchstone for like, what do swing voters think? Like, because she, voted for George W. Bush and Barack Obama, but hates Trump for a million reasons. And my dad is a Republican, and he's a deacon at our Catholic church, and holds a lot of conservative views on issues that align with that perspective, and also hates Donald Trump because he thinks he's a horrible human. And so my dad, who usually doesn't get involved in things like this, helped to caucus and organize their whole caucus for Marco Rubio in the primary. The first time around with Trump. So, they have their own kind of perspectives on things, and are really those kind of people who look at a candidate and say, like, is this person a good human? Does their values align with mine? Maybe I'm not going to agree with them on everything, but I don't agree with the other person on everything either. So how can I find kind of the person that could best represent me?
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the conversations I've heard you in are with folks that are coming from within a silo of sorts, especially when you're talking with someone on the Democratic side, which you identify with. It seems that your family, your background lends itself to thinking about people that you love that think differently than that Democratic or progressive silo. And again, you identify that way. I think you call yourself a pragmatic progressive.
That's right.
But I wonder if that is how unique that is, or are there more people who can have those conversations with family members who maybe even voted for Trump? Or is it as much of a bubble that people stay within on each side, and you're really more of the unicorn?
Well, I think I'm more of a unicorn in Washington, D.C. than elsewhere. I think in the country, the bulk of people can have a conversation about, a lot of different things that they might disagree about, and do so in a way that doesn't come to blows. In Washington, that's less true. So I often describe my work as saying, especially on these kind of social issues that we work on, whether it's immigration or guns or LGBT or abortion, that most people in Washington are paid to make those issues seem black and white. That's their job, is to say either you're evil or you're on the good side, like be on the right side of history or not. And the truth is that all of those issues are much more gray. And that's what most people in the country think, is that, we do need to wrestle with some of these things, and it's not completely black and white. And so, one of my favorite pollsters, Robbie Jones at Public Religion Research, asked this great question in a survey where he asked separately, instead of saying, are you pro-life or pro-choice? He asked two separate questions. He said, do you identify as pro-life? And then another question later said, do you identify as pro-choice? And there was a huge chunk of Americans that said yes to both of those.
Oh, that's interesting.
And if you ask it as an either or, you're never going to figure that out, right? Like when you look at it, you're going to see, 50.1% on this side and 49.9% on this side if you only present it as you have to pick one or the other. But actually, there's a lot of folks who, believe that 7 in 10 in a recent poll we did believe that abortion is the taking of a human life. But they also believe that it should be something that is a decision between a woman, her family, and her doctor. And there's about 40% of the country that says yes to both of those things.
Yeah.
And so much of our political conversation acts as if those people don't exist, acts as if you have to only believe one of those statements is true. So trying to help people understand the complications of that narrative is like not necessarily a popular thing to do in DC, but I think it's really needed.
Yeah. So your education, you were trained as a lawyer and have experience professionally as a lawyer, but a lot of the conversations I hear you participate in, you're answering folks that have really strong opinions about something with data. I was wondering where you learned the art of getting these insights, because even certain I don't want to even call them polls, but it's like they're more they include a lot of data, but it's also narrative. It's explanatory on a deeper level. Where did you learn that craft, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think in law school, I learned how to kind of put together a persuasive argument in general. I think it made me better at writing and oral argument for sure, but obviously wasn't on these topic areas. It was on mostly very boring topic areas around things that I didn't really want to spend my whole life thinking about. But when I came to Third Way in 2008, we had a big poll in the field in California the day after the Proposition 8 vote happened, which was the vote that took back marriage equality. And we were the only ones with those numbers. So I had to figure out how to read a poll, read a crosstab, figure out what that even meant, and kind of make sense of this complicated thing where a state that we see generally is very blue had actually repealed marriage equality in the state when it was put to the voters. And in places like San Francisco, only 6 in 10 people voted to uphold marriage equality. There was about 40% that didn't. That's not your stereotype of San Francisco, right? So we had to try to figure out like what's going on under here. And I so often think that most political pollsters or advocacy groups that are using public opinion research in politics use it to try to prove their own point. They use it to try to prove that they're right. I can write 18 more polls that tell you that 95% of people support universal background checks. Great, but that's not actually like moving us forward because those people aren't all in Congress, unfortunately. But what we try to do is understand what the tensions are underneath something. So why is it that the fact that we have 95% support for universal background checks doesn't translate into policy change? And the answer is because most people don't think it will actually impact crime rates. And most people don't think that it is something that would impact their community. So when you have like surface level agreement to this question, but people don't think it's that important or that impactful, you're not going to have the policy change that you need. And asking those questions is very unpopular because a lot of the gun safety groups would rather not ask those questions. They'd rather just have the 95%. But I think in order to build kind of sustainable change over time, you have to understand what's really going on with people so that you can persuade them, so that you can address the concerns that they have. And how are you going to do that if you don't know what's holding them back?
It seems like your subtext often when in these conversations is, do you want to be right or do you want to win?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So I was actually curious about another situation, another experience you had on President. You've mentioned your family's involvement with the Catholic Church and your time on President Obama's advisory council on faith-based and neighborhood partnerships. Are you still a religious person, or?
I'm not active in any organized religion. I have my own spirituality, but I am also a gay woman who grew up in a time when the Catholic Church wasn't really about that. So have not participated in any formal way. In fact, I used to, up until 2012, my dad and I would do the Christmas services. We were the singers at the Christmas services, the two of us. And that year was the year that Minnesota had a ballot initiative on marriage, and the Minnesota Catholic Church was the #1 contributor to stopping marriage equality in the state. So I decided that it was time for me to stop, singing at the church masses at that point. But that doesn't erase, many, like 4 decades of my own personal experience.
Yeah. I'm afraid that we found a good church, but the die was already cast in a way. I raised my kids in the church, actually mostly a Baptist church here in Santa Clarita, just north of LA, which is like, it's about as Idaho as Southern California gets. I don't know if you would recognize this name, but it's the valley where John MacArthur's Master's University is. And a lot of the churches around here are church plants from Grace Community. But we ended up finding a church that I've learned a lot from down in Pasadena, not only accepting, but the word affirming, and the idea of affirming, which right. I find really encouraging. And edifying and inspiring, and I'm just learning so much. But I wanted to get back to the advisory council, faith-based neighborhood partnerships. I've heard from others on that advisory council that it would sometimes get stuck because some advisors close in the administration, and often the loudest voices in the room, had this default aversion for religious folks and religion in general. So is that fair to say, or did you have a different experience?
I think that's fair to say. And, I will tell you, the fact that I was the one on the faith-based council tells you how short the bench is of Democrats who they could appoint that even knew how to talk about, issues of faith or to people of faith. Because as you said, I'm not a practicing Catholic, nor is it my job. My job is to understand what kind of swing voters think about things and how to persuade them. I don't have any kind of specific faith-based component to my job. It just happens that, a lot of times swing voters are also people of faith. And so I had some experience in trying to understand that view. But when they came to me and said, will you be on the faith-based council? I was like, really? Is this because you don't know any other Democrats? Like, I don't know. What qualifies me to be that?
You're like, have we met?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that I was one of that. It was their 3rd advisory council on faith-based and neighborhood partnerships, and we had helped them find people for the first one because we had done an initiative in 2008. My colleague Rachel Lazar led it, on bringing together, we called it Come Let Us Reason Together. And we brought evangelicals and other conservative religious leaders together with progressive leaders to talk about whether there was some common ground that we could find that we could then support newly elected President Obama in taking. So it was reducing the need for abortion while protecting the right to have one by funding teen pregnancy prevention programs and also healthcare for young children for people who can't afford it. It was ending torture because this was coming right off the George W. Bush administration. It was employment non-discrimination for gay and lesbian folks. and immigration reform. And so we brought some of these big megachurch pastors to the Obama administration, and they put them on their first council. But that council decided to tackle the issue of abortion. And that was very difficult. Yeah. And it was in the midst of, if you recall, the debate about Obamacare and whether there was going to be taxpayer funds used for abortion services now that the government was going to be more involved in healthcare. And it really just burned the whole thing down because it created so much strife and just ill will on that advisory committee that the next time around they decided to do human trafficking because they figured no one can be, opposed to stopping human trafficking. Yeah. So let's go from abortion to like the most common ground issue possible. And then my council was tasked with understanding how community-based organizations could help advance anti-poverty efforts. So again, a much less controversial topic than the first one. So they came to me and said, will you be on this council? And I thought it was super fun and great. I got to meet a bunch of people that I wouldn't have before, but it also really showed you what a disconnect there is between democratic politics and people of faith who represent a majority of this country, and including a majority of the people that vote for Democrats. Yeah. So at the same time, I went to the Democratic National Convention that year. It was nominating Hillary Clinton, and they had all these buttons everywhere, right? It was like newly married for Hillary and yoga instructors for Hillary, and like literally every adjective you could think of about a human had a button for it. And there was no Catholics for Hillary, Christians for Hillary. There was Muslims for Hillary. Because that's seen as like an out group potentially, but there wasn't anything for somebody who might want to say I'm a person of faith and I support Hillary Clinton. And I thought that really spoke, a lot about the state of where the Democratic leaders were at that point, that they wouldn't even have thought to print that, even though it's a descriptor that would describe most of their coalition.
Right. If you read any of Ryan Burgess's data, it indicates that folks who identify as religious in general is a declining percentage, and Christians in particular is a declining percentage. Yet it's still a majority of American populace. It seems to me like a huge missed opportunity because there are issues. I mean, kids in cages, how the prior administrations, the way they dealt with people at the border. There were a lot of friends, even from my Grace Baptist days that were just appalled at that. And yet the abortion issue is just a non-starter. Yeah. So it always makes me wonder, can we, whether it's about folks who are pro-life, who identify as strictly pro-life, or more in general, can the Democratic Party hold space for folks that aren't orthodox that don't check every box? God forbid, so to speak, there should be a nominee of like a pro-life Democrat who's running for a seat in Congress, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to try to create space because the Democratic Party has to be a big tent or else it cannot win. It happens to be that Republicans have a bigger base. So oftentimes in certain places and in key states, they can win by just riling up people who already agree with them. Yeah. That is not true for Democrats. And especially with the Republican Party, following this more and more extreme vision, which looks very different than it did when I first got to DC in 2006, where their party has gone. It is all the more important to me as a center left Democrat that we maintain that big tent coalition and not say, if you don't agree with me on every single thing on this questionnaire, then you can't be in our club. We really need to be bringing people into the club, not kicking them out.
Yeah, it seems like the debate is between do we win by a big turnout, and that's the operation, or if you listen to Mike Madrid, like he said it time and time again, the 2022 election was older, whiter, and more Republican.
That's right.
And the reason that Democrats did much better than expected, winning a seat in the Senate, not losing nearly as many seats in the House as was projected, is because there was effective persuasion of those older, whiter Republican or historically Republican voters, which speaks actually to the work that you do with Third Way. It's a lot of the work that you do at Third Way is illuminating the plurality of voters who don't align with the extremes of one party or the other. So could you tell us a little bit more about Third Way or as an organization, and specifically what you do with Third Way?
Yeah, so Third Way was formed in right after the loss of John Kerry in 2004 to George W. Bush, trying to think about how Democrats could continue to win and build majority coalitions in a system that is, at least in some ways, overrepresents rural areas, redder areas, specifically the Senate and the Electoral College. You can run up the score in California as much as you want, but you only get 2 Senate votes for California, and so does South Dakota. So, there are these kind of structural things about our system that I don't think are changing anytime soon. And the bases are asymmetrical. There's a smaller progressive base than there is a conservative base in the country. So, Third Way was formed to try to think about how can we build sustainable progress by bringing together a bunch of people who support that thing. And, I think part of what we try to avoid is it's very bad policy making to, do a bunch of changes. And then in the next 2 years, you undo all those changes. And then the next 2 years, you redo all those changes. And that's really a lot of what we've seen over the past couple of decades is executive action that then gets overturned. And, the one that makes my heart hurt the most right now is the Dreamers, the DACA program, which allowed folks who have never known any country to be their home except for this one, but were brought here without a proper documentation as children, that program is about to be struck down by the Supreme Court. And it is going to leave 1 million people who came out, were promised, safety, are now sitting on a list in the Department of Homeland Security. It's going to leave them without any options. And that's horrible. That is not how we should be governing in our country. And so I think, our general proposition, whether it's on clean energy or the economy or higher education or these social issues, is to try to think about how can we make progress, pragmatic, progressive progress that's actually sustainable, that doesn't create a backlash that undoes it later in public opinion, that doesn't, leave some folks behind and then create people that are, atomized against that thing, but really tries to make sure that the policy changes we're making in the country have broad support so that, they can continue moving forward regardless of how much back and forth there is in the control of Congress.
Yeah. Now, you having a background in constitutional law, it seems to me that a lot of folks look at executive actions or cases that come out of the Supreme Court as legislation. And if you were to listen to someone like Sarah Isgur, her interpretation of some of the rulings that have come out of SCOTUS and other federal courts is basically judges saying to the legislative branch, hey, do your job. So you talk about being a pragmatic progressive and creating effective legislation. Can you unpack that? What does it mean to be a pragmatic progressive?
Yeah, I'll give you a really specific example from this past summer. So we were helping the gun safety movement and members of Congress try to figure out whether there was any action that could be taken after the horrible massacre at Uvalde. We were all shocked by that. And we've worked on guns since the founding of Third Way, worked very closely with the Sandy Hook families after that horrible massacre and almost got background checks across the finish line. But it was clear that that wasn't going to be on the table this time. Like, we couldn't even pass it when we had nearly 60 Democratic votes in the Senate, let alone 50. So we were worried that what was going to happen there was the kind of advocacy organizations would say, we want universal background checks and an assault weapons ban or nothing. And the, NRA folks would say, great, we'll do nothing. But instead, what ended up happening, and I think this is in great credit to the senators who negotiated it and also to the gun safety movement who said, we will take any progress we can make. They managed to get the first bipartisan gun bill across the finish line in 3 decades. I was 10 last time we did something about guns. And it invested in mental health services. It made it easier and incentivized states to create red flag laws for people to be able to say, I'm very concerned about this person and the fact that they might be violent. And so can we temporarily remove their access to firearms? Really good, important policies, closing the boyfriend loophole, which was basically saying, if you were married to someone and you had a domestic violence incident that you were convicted of, that could limit your access to firearms. But if you were not married to them, then it wouldn't. And, there is a huge, huge connection between gun violence and domestic violence. And it's a big driver of murders of people that are being domestically abused. So those are important things that got done. And I think there are some who would say, well, that's just like nibbling around the edges and, giving the Republicans something to say that they did, even though it didn't address the bigger issues. What I would say is we got to take what we can get. And also by doing so, we create an incentive to come back and do it again.
Yeah.
You've got people like John Cornyn, who literally were senator from Texas, was standing on the floor of the Senate with Senator Kyrsten Sinema and said, okay, let's do immigration next, because he felt good about getting it done. He wanted to do something. It happened in his state. And he's a human being who saw what happened at Uvalde and felt like, I have to do something. Well, he's also in the state where the kids were in cages. Like, he may feel now he can do something there, especially if he doesn't get a real backlash from the right. If he, feels supported, then he can take the next step. And, I just think creating those kinds of incentives is what we need to do. And too often it's an all or nothing proposition. The kind of opposite example is there were a lot of folks working on some compromise legislation around Roe versus Wade, and the reproductive rights movement said, no, we want the Women's Health Protection Act or nothing. And, that's a very different approach. And so I think I would say, like, we should try to get what we can get done and then do it again, do it again, and do it again, instead of holding out and making the perfect the enemy of the good.
Right. And it seems like the Biden administration is more aligned with what you're saying, because the State of the Union definitely underscored that. If you really think about it, there's been a long list of accomplishments, but if you look at those accomplishments, so many of them, to your point, gun legislation, like, we got stuff done on guns, and it was Cornyn, a Republican senator, who was leading negotiations, or healthcare cost. They call it the Inflation Reduction Act, but the healthcare cost and environmental bill was the most conservative Democrat in the Senate who led those negotiations. Bipartisan infrastructure actually got done. It was all bipartisan. And, to your point, what's the expression? The enemy of the good, let me get something, and as opposed to insisting on everything, and being totally orthodox to a pure version of what we want, or else we don't want anything. I appreciate incremental progress that folks that maybe I disagree with on any number of other issues with, that we can come to some good conclusion for the betterment of us all.
And I always say, I think there's good compromise and bad compromise, right? Good compromise is the kind of compromise that is the gun bill that we discussed, is getting something done that matters and creating incentive to come back and do it again. Bad compromise creates kind of what I would call an off ramp. Like, let's deal with the easiest part of this, and then we're never going to come back and touch it again. So there are issues on which I think it gets more complicated. For example, if you're saying, well, I'm going to protect this one group of people, but not this other group of people, I'm going to leave them behind. And I know that they're actually the most vulnerable group of people. So it's not that, you might think I work at Third Way, so I think all compromise is good. It's not. There are some deals that aren't worth taking, but I think the vast, vast majority can be made into good deals if you, say, here are my red lines and here are my red lines, and then you work between them.
I think I'm hearing the musician in you talk, that there's room for violins and cellos and percussion and piano, but let's all agree that we're following the same score, the same composition, at least stay within those, have some sort of common frame of reference. So
that's right.
What is the current makeup of the Democratic Party? Have you taken a look at that post 2022 election?
Yeah, I think we've looked at it a whole bunch of different ways. I think it's clear that the increase in education polarization has really changed both parties' coalitions over the past couple of elections. So by that I mean, before 2016, there wasn't a big difference between how people voted based on whether or not they had a college degree. So there might have been a difference based on gender or race. The average man would vote different than the average woman. The average, African American might vote different than the average white voter. But really, what started to come into play in 2016 and beyond was huge divergences among people of the same race of different educational credentials. And so Democrats keep increasing their support among college educated voters of every race, but they are losing support from non-college educated voters of every race. And it started with white non-college voters, which was a big topic of conversation, obviously, when Trump was elected. But it has continued with non-college voters of color, and we have continued to see an erosion of the Democratic Party's support there. I think that's very disconcerting because, in its best iteration, the Democratic Party is supposed to be the party of people who work hard, the party of people who want to earn a good life. And if we continue to only be able to appeal to college educated voters, it's only about a third of the electorate. It doesn't make up a winning coalition. And it kind of skews our priorities and our worldview. It makes us concentrate more on things like, student loan cancellation than things like investing in apprenticeships. It changes the policies that you support when your coalition shifts like that. So I don't want to be part of a Democratic Party that is only appealing to college educated voters and making people without a 4-year degree feel like I look down upon them. That's not who I am, and that's not the party I want to convey. But I think increasingly that is the kind of silo in which folks live in DC, and so they can't even see that their friend group is not necessarily representative of most of the country.
Right. Now, I know you did a post 2020 political autopsy on the Democratic Party. Have you done that? First of all, I'd love for you to dive a little bit deeper into what you found 2 years ago. But have you done a similar analysis post 2022?
Yeah, so we did a huge analysis in 2020 together with a bunch of different groups because we didn't want people to think, oh, this is just third way's perspective. We worked with the Latino Victory Project and the Congressional Black Caucus and a whole bunch of other folks to put that together so that it could be kind of the definitive autopsy of what had happened in 2020 and not look like it was just kind of third way spin. And what we found there was that most people that weren't Joe Biden, who were on the ticket as Democrats, did worse than Joe Biden. And in part, that was because the Democratic brand was really hurting them with a lot of voters. People don't love a generic Democrat. And they knew who Joe Biden was. They knew Joe Biden wasn't going to defund the police. Like he's not that guy. So he was able to create his own brand. But if you were someone that didn't have, $2 trillion to spend in a presidential campaign, it was harder for you to do that. And so we've worked really hard to help folks over that next 2 years realize that there are a lot of problems with the generic Democratic brand, particularly outside of big cities, outside of college educated suburbs, and that they need to kind of rebut the attacks and not just ignore them. There is a common wisdom in DC that if you're talking about the issue your opponent wants to talk about, you're doing their job for them. So you should just change the subject to the thing that you want to talk about. Well, that's not very satisfying if you're a voter who cares about that thing, right? So saying, okay, well, we're not going to talk about immigration anyways, healthcare prices, like that doesn't actually tell me anything about the thing I'm worried about. You're just changing the subject, and that's very obvious. So we've worked with folks to try to help them say, I do believe we need to have order at the border. I do believe we need to make changes to our immigration system. And I'm going to deliver on healthcare costs to, make sure that the kind of far right isn't the only people that are talking about those issues, because issues like crime and immigration, they matter to people. And to pretend that they don't and just change the subject to the thing you want to talk about instead feels very dismissive, and I don't think really works for people.
Yeah. Now this is very self-serving of me, but I'm going to have you help us with California 27. I don't know how much you study individual House races, but ours is a fascinating district. It was California 25. Now it's California 27. It was redrawn. It was already a Biden plus. I think in the last election, Biden plus 8. It was redrawn as a Biden plus 12. And yet Mike Garcia won in the special election after Katie Hill resigned. And then he won 2020 by the thinnest of margins, 333 votes out of over 340,000 that voted in this district. He won by a little bit more decisively in 2022. So how is California 27? How did we lose that race? Was it because Christy Smith ran in all three of those races? So what is it, purely the candidate? Is it that would you make more of a critique about her campaign? Is it a lack of support from the national party? How did they lose this district?
Yeah, I think there's two things going on there. One is that Kevin McCarthy, as horrible as he is on many things, has been quite good at recruiting diverse candidates for Republicans. And that has really worked for them. They have decided in the last few cycles that they are going to try to recruit Latino candidates, Black candidates, women candidates, vet candidates.
Are we going to talk about the gay Republican candidate?
Oh, definitely
Congress
not.
member?
This is not going to George Santos. No.
Thank you. Okay.
No, but the Latino vote is one of the ones where Democrats have been eroding the quickest because of a real feeling of disconnect. And so if you can recruit someone, not to say that Latino voters are just going to vote for another Latino, but if what you're worried about is that the Republican Party is exclusionary of Latinos, and your Republican candidate is a Latino candidate, that calms your fears a little bit about that, right? And so I think that was very smart. The other thing is what we saw in quite a few blue states, which is folks pushing back against the things that the blue state had done, and also not necessarily turning out around something like abortion, because people in California do not think that like Gavin Newsom's going to sign an abortion ban. And they're right? That's true. So there wasn't that piece playing into it like there was in some of the other states, but also in Oregon, in New York, in California, people have been really concerned about crime. They've been really concerned about homelessness. They've been really concerned about just kind of like chaos, post-pandemic chaos, and feeling like they can see that in their own community, and they don't trust Democrats on those issues. So I think we did 8 post-election focus groups the week after the election with a mix of people from different places, but in every single one of them, we heard people saying, "Well, I voted for this party at the top of the ticket because of this dynamic, but then I voted lower down about this." And for example, in Georgia, people said, "Well, I voted for Brian Kemp for governor because I think he's done a pretty good job at dealing with, crime and homelessness. But I voted for Democrats for the state legislature because I don't like his position on abortion and I want him to have a check." So we heard that in Ohio. We heard that in Arizona. We heard it so many places. And it just reminded me, like, people act like swing voters are dumb or like just not paying attention. They are paying attention. And they know, that in order to kind of balance the excesses that they might be worried about with each party, they're going to have to make some decisions where they're saying, okay, you can be in charge of this, but you should be in charge of this. And I feel like that is really what we saw in a lot of those races that we lost in New York, where people are very concerned about crime. And in those races in Oregon and California on the West Coast, where people were very worried about crime, homelessness, and other kind of chaos in the streets, and they just didn't trust Democrats to deal with it.
Yeah. No, to your point, in this district, we voted for the Democrat for the state assembly, and yet we reelected Mike Garcia to go back to the U.S. House. I've seen it in other states as well. I mean, Wisconsin is a good example. Mm-hmm. Your home state of Minnesota flipped its state legislature, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Do you think the Democratic Party is doing enough at the state and local level?
I mean, the answer is always no, right? And you can, you can always find an example of where Democrats are much more focused on Congress than they are on the states, even though the states are the ones that are making most of the policy on most of the things we seem to care the most about.
Yeah.
In part, I think it's because we would prefer to do things by, nationwide decree, right? It seems a lot easier to just tell everyone they have to do this thing. And that's kind of our natural go-to, whereas the Republicans have been very good at using federalism to their own advantage. But I also think it's in part because the infrastructure on the left really focuses on a single issue area, not necessarily on kind of the infrastructure of the whole. And so, you might see whether it's a small dollar donor or a billionaire giving money to climate, giving money to reproductive rights, giving money to an issue area, but not investing in, the infrastructure to elect Democrats at the state level who could then put in place the policies that those different advocacy groups want. So I think we're very driven by kind of issue-based politics, and that means a lot of times we don't see where there's an overlap, that you might need multiple different issues to come together to do that same thing to make progress on any of them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of folks would do well to study when Michael Steele was running the RNC and how long lasting the groundwork that he set up. We're still seeing it today. That was some, man, I admire him just as a person and how he's evolved politically. But man, that work is we're still feeling the ripples of it today.
That's right.
Yeah. I'd love to talk about, though, a little bit. I know we don't want to talk about George Santos. That's not.
We can. It's just not that productive. I don't think there's anything I have to say that anyone else hasn't.
I know. Well, on a more broad scale, as a relative outsider watching, from the outside looking in, it looks like the Republican Party's kind of impaling themselves. If you look at their behavior at the State of the Union or these committees, it seems like they're doing themselves great harm. And yet, if you were to listen to a Jim Jordan interview on Meet the Press or Marjorie Taylor Greene on a moment-by-moment basis, their behavior indicates that they think they're acting in a rather heroic way. So is it just me? Are they indeed myopic enough to think they're heroic when they are indeed impaling themselves? Or is there this huge constituency that's like cheering them on? Yeah, he's a liar. And, go. Let's investigate Hunter Biden's laptop in Libya and Benghazi. And I don't know. It's like a whole new thing. I don't know.
I mean, there is certainly a group that's cheering them on somewhere. But, I think it's yet another example of how Republicans judge their success by whether Tucker Carlson or Fox News are happy with it, as opposed to, whether the median swing voter is. And, a lot of that comes from the fact that those members don't ever have to worry about their general election campaigns. Those are not folks that are...
MTG isn't going to be challenged in Georgia 14 or whatever it is.
And if she was, it would probably be from the right. So she's more concerned about what Republican primary voters think, and not that concerned about, about what the general electorate thinks. And I don't think she's, talking that much to Mike Garcia either, because I don't think he thinks it's particularly useful what she's doing. But, I think the perfect example of that dichotomy, I think, is Ron DeSantis. Obviously Ron DeSantis is thinking about running for president, is doing all of these things on culture wars that, flying immigrants to Martha's Vineyard and, these stunts.
Anti-woke laws. And
with the College Board and Disney. And I mean, it's all over the place. He's not doing that because he thinks that wins general election voters. In fact, he did not run one ad on those things during his general election. He ran ads on funding the education system and things that he never talks about during the primary, because he knows that the views of Republican primary voters and the views of the general electorate are not the same thing. And I think for Democrats, a lot of Democratic primary voters are much more moderate or conservative than kind of the extremes of our party. You know, that's why we got Joe Biden, right? That Black voters in South Carolina were like, no way are we putting up Bernie Sanders. But the other benefit is that Democrats care about winning. And so we kind of do a pundit thing where we think like, is this person electable? Not just, is this my favorite human on the planet, or are they saying something that makes me excited? Republicans do not care about electability right now. That is not a thing they're focused on. That came across very clearly in our polling and also in their primary results. And so they just have this different dynamic going on where they're only paying attention to like the 10% most right-wing people in the country. And among that group, maybe they're being really successful, but that does not set them up well, I think, for those general election conversations where, it is 100% clear that people rejected extremes, the Carrie Lakes of the world, the Herschel Walkers of the world, all of the election deniers that were running for positions in swing states lost. And that tells you, I think, that there's something else going on, and people really they're looking for the party that can be the most mainstream, not the most extreme.
Right. Yeah, there are still a number of House districts that Biden won that Republicans are still in. That they won in the Republicans won in those districts, mine being one of them. You've already touched upon it here and there, but what do Democrats need to do to win back the House, to win those districts and win back the House?
I think we need to maintain our image as the mainstream party. And I think, Mike Garcia is a great example. He wasn't a scary monster, right? He wasn't Carrie Lake.
I kind of disagree with that.
Do you?
I do. I know that he did a few things that, number one, his name is Mike Garcia. Number two, he has a lot of money coming in from his corporate backers. McCarthy funneled a lot of money his way. And he ran a fairly aggressive campaign. But so the reason I push back on it is if you look at his voting record, particularly starting on January 6th and January 7th, 2021, he voted to overturn. I know you're not technically not overturn the election, but he voted to challenge in Arizona and Pennsylvania. And he didn't even understand the laws that he was voting to challenge. He didn't understand that it was Pennsylvania's Republican-led House that passed a law in 2019 that he was challenging. It was a Republican-led House. He didn't even understand the laws that he was challenging. But then if you look at in particular, his record of public statements, might as well come right out of Lauren Boebert, right out of MTG.
This is what's a little scary to me is that, as people have said, oh, well, maybe some of these Republicans that are in Biden districts are going to push the caucus to a more moderate place. But they didn't wield that power at all during the crazy speaker fight.
Right.
And they don't seem willing to do so. That is worrisome. I think Mike Garcia paints himself as not Carrie Lake, but he's actually behaving like Carrie Lake. So to your point, it's very worrisome. And
he hasn't shown up on any news outlets other than, Newsmax and Fox Business and Fox News. So he's speaking and representing only the extreme wing of his party based on his voting record and based on his record of public statements. And what bugs me is that in a lot of those public statements, he does what a lot of folks inside of that information silo do, which is basically generalize and mischaracterize folks who are Democrats or even folks who voted Democrat and vilify and make an enemy out of, as if we got to defeat them. They're our enemies. And I'm thinking, you know what? I'm actually an independent. I'm a fiscal conservative. I vote largely Republican at the state and local level, but I am alienated by that language because I live in a house with people who vote for Democrats. I work with a lot of people who are like, you're talking about my friends. They're not my enemies. They're my neighbors. They're my loved ones who might vote differently than I do on particular issues. But that's why I can't get on board with Mike Garcia. If there was an independent Republican, sorry, this is my thing. It's like you lit the fuse, Good. If there was a Republican, if there was a Mitt Romney-esque Republican in my district, I'd be 100% on board. But you know what? Christy Smith one can critique her campaign and that it wasn't aggressive enough, but Christy Smith made room for guys like me. I introduced myself when she was in the assembly as the guy who voted against her. And she asked me why. I said, I'm a small business person, and some of the legislation she was supporting was not in my best interest. She said, join me on my small business committee. And even on the small business committee, there was a lot that we disagreed on, but she worked hard to find ways of collaborating, of finding things that she could advocate for me or work into legislation that she was supporting, as opposed to treating me like a villain or an enemy. So anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's your answer about how we win those seats back. But I think it needs to be more than just Christy Smith, right? We need to make sure that the spokespeople for the Democratic Party nationally, the people that are the loudest, are also carrying that message. Because right now we do have a lot of loud people in the party who are carrying different kinds of messages. And so, and I don't think that our goal should be to make those people stop speaking. Those people should speak, and they represent their district, and that's fine. But the Democrats that are more the Christy Smith model have been quieter than some of those super far left folks, and I think that's the piece that needs to change. We need to, exactly as you said, create room. You can be a kind of Democrat. You can vote for Democrats and look like this. And so that's really what, we hope to help folks do over the next couple of years.
Yeah. To your point, when I see different pundits on TV or elected officials, or for some reason, Simone Sanders is coming to mind versus somebody like Mayor Pete, they probably have a lot of similarities in terms of legislation that they actually support, but somehow Mayor Pete is able to hang on Fox News and be in the conversation, in certain circles, and is more palatable. It's not just delivery. I think it's a whole posture. It's a whole disposition in a way,
Yeah. And I think he, has had to persuade lots of different kinds of people in his life and be surrounded by lots of different kinds of people. And I think that is the way that we kind of break down this polarization, right? Is to have conversations like the ones you host, and have conversations in our living room where we're talking to people that might not agree with us about everything, because it helps you understand that person isn't a monster. They have a viewpoint for a reason, and maybe even they have some good points, and maybe you should work responses to those points into your thing. And the more we do that, and the more we engage, the more we can both advance our own goals, but elect people who will. And the more we silo ourselves and say, like, it's uncomfortable, I'm only going to talk to people I agree with 100%, like, the less we're going to be able to build governing coalitions.
Yeah. How do we do this thing better? That's where politics and religion come in. It's figuring out how to live together among each other, and,
that's right.
Nurturing relationships across our differences, nurturing community across our differences. So a couple more questions. One is, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah. Who would you love to interview that you haven't been able to yet?
Oh, I got a long list. So you were at the top of the list. So I was thrilled when you said yes. Because I've heard you on other platforms, but then hearing you, over the last year or two on Ron's platform, Politicology, I was like, I got to get Lanae. So I was really thrilled that you came on. I would say that there are thinkers and writers that it would just make my day. Strangely, the first person that comes to mind is Wynton Marsalis.
Oh, that would be a great interview.
Yeah, I don't think he would give me the time of day, but if he ever did, it would be the highlight of my life so far. Just because he's done a lot more work. His music, we all know him as a great jazz musician, and the work he does at Lincoln Center, but his work is infused with a sense of theological profundity. It's infused with an awareness of our political history, and I'd love to talk to him about that. A couple others that come to mind. I mean, David Brooks, I think, is one of my favorite writers. I'd love to talk to him. David French is another one. Peggy Noonan. I would love to talk to Peggy Noonan, or the historian. Oh gosh, I can't believe I forgot her name off the top of my. She was born in Brooklyn, was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan, moved to Boston. She worked, I think, for the Lyndon Johnson administration. She's a great historian. Do you know who I'm thinking of?
No.
Oh, I can't believe I forgot her name. occasionally she's still on the Sunday morning shows. A book she released about a year or two ago was comparing 4 American leaders: Teddy Roosevelt, Lincoln, LBJ, and FDR.
Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Thank you. Yes, Doris Kearns Goodwin. She would definitely be at the very, very top of the list.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, there's a few that come to mind.
Love it.
Yeah. Okay. How can we find you online? More information about Third Way and all the great work that you're doing.
Yeah, so all of our work and analysis and all the data you can dig through yourself are at thirdway.org. And I am still on Twitter, although less frequently, at Lanae Erickson.
So are you going to go to like Mastodon or Post News? Or
It all seems so complicated. And I've kind of been like moving away from social media anyways, because, the Twitterati is its own little bubble. So so we'll see. The thing is, I kind of have to tweet for my job because that's where a lot of reporters get their information at this point, and they don't really check their email. So I'm still tied to it in certain ways, but I try to infuse it with lots of like French bulldog content and other things, and not just the latest Third Way report. That's
awesome. Yeah, it's fun. It's a good follow. So I'm much more discerning and have narrowed down who I'm following and who I'm allowing to engage with me since it's gone to the dogs. Well, not the right dogs. It's just whatever. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, this has been a real thrill. I'm so glad to get to know you. And I'm telling you, if you're in SoCal, we got to do sushi. You told me sushi. I know. That sounds delightful. And if I'm in DC, I will hit you up because that's great. I would love to I'd love to continue the conversation. So thanks again. Thanks so much for having me. You bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, please hit that subscribe button. Follow us, leave a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend about us. We're easier to recommend than ever. It's politicsandreligion.us. It's www.politicsandreligion.us, or you can find me online at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey with an E, and S as in Sam, at Corey S. Nathan. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week. Thank you for joining us today. If you dig what we're doing here, it is super easy to follow us. You can go to our site, politicsandreligion.us. That's with the and spelled out, A-N-D. Politicsandreligion.us. And we're on all the socials, at TP and R Pod. TP and R Pod for Talking Politics and Religion Pod. And here's a big way you can support us, by becoming one of our patrons. You can even become a producer or executive producer of our program and have a lot more say in who we bring on, the kinds of questions we explore, or just help us keep the lights on. But mostly, we really appreciate you giving us a listen. So for the whole team here at Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, thanks for hanging out with us. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.